He told me I was carrying his miracle, that our baby would make us a family forever. 3 weeks after I gave birth, he blocked me on everything and moved across the country without leaving a forwarding address. He told me I was carrying his miracle, that our baby would make us a family forever. 3 weeks after I gave birth, he blocked me on everything and moved across the country without leaving a forwarding address. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. The positive pregnancy test appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, two pink lines that changed everything in ways I thought I understood but absolutely didn't. I had been dating Marcus for 8 months, long enough to believe we were building something real, but not long enough to have tested that belief against any genuine adversity. The pregnancy was unplanned but not unwelcome, at least not for me. Marcus's reaction to the news was immediate and overwhelming joy that seemed too perfect to be real, but felt genuine enough to trust. He cried when I showed him the test, holding me close and whispering about miracles and destiny and how this baby was meant to bring us together forever. He called his mother before I had even processed the reality myself, announcing that he was going to be a father with pride that made my chest warm with hope about our future. That first day, Marcus was everything I could have wanted in a partner facing unexpected pregnancy. He researched prenatal vitamins, downloaded pregnancy apps, and started talking immediately about practical considerations like health insurance, living arrangements, and preparing for parenthood. His enthusiasm was infectious and reassuring, making the scary prospect of unplanned pregnancy feel like an adventure we would navigate together. Marcus had been charming from our first date, the kind of man who made grand romantic gestures and spoke confidently about building a life together. He was 28, worked in sales at a tech company, and had the easy confidence that comes from being conventionally attractive and socially skilled. Our relationship had moved quickly but felt natural, progressing from casual dating to serious commitment with the kind of intensity that can either indicate genuine compatibility or mutual delusion. His reaction to my pregnancy seemed to confirm that our whirlwind romance was based on real connection rather than just physical attraction and good timing. Marcus spoke about the baby as proof that we were meant to be together, that the universe had intervened to create the family he had always dreamed of having. He had never been married, never had children, and claimed to have been waiting for the right woman to build something permanent with. Within a week of learning about the pregnancy, Marcus had moved into my apartment, bringing his clothes, furniture, and an acoustic guitar he played badly but enthusiastically. The decision felt rushed but logical given our changed circumstances and his expressed desire to be present for every moment of the pregnancy. He wanted to be the kind of father who was involved from the beginning, who didn't miss appointments or milestones because of work or other priorities. Marcus threw himself into pregnancy preparation with an intensity that was both touching and slightly overwhelming. He read parenting books, researched baby gear, and started a savings account specifically for pregnancy and delivery expenses. He would fall asleep with his hand on my still flat stomach, talking to the baby about all the adventures they would have together once she was born. His excitement was particularly focused on the idea of having a daughter, which we learned at the 12-week ultrasound. Marcus cried again during that appointment, staring at the grainy image on the screen with wonder that seemed genuine and profound. He immediately started calling the baby his little princess, making plans for tea parties and dance lessons, and protecting her from boys who wouldn't deserve her attention. The romantic fantasy Marcus constructed around our pregnancy was elaborate and appealing, involving everything from family traditions we would create to the values we would instill in our daughter. He spoke about teaching her to be strong and independent, about being the kind of father who would support her dreams regardless of how unconventional they might be. He promised to be present for every important moment, to never let work or other obligations interfere with his responsibilities as a parent. But even during those early months when Marcus's enthusiasm felt genuine and comprehensive, there were subtle signs that his commitment was more theoretical than practical. He would research baby gear extensively but rarely made actual purchases, claiming he wanted to wait until closer to the due date to avoid accumulating unnecessary items. He talked constantly about the savings account for baby expenses, but contributed to it irregularly and in amounts that didn't match his stated income. More concerning was Marcus's tendency to frame the pregnancy in terms of how it would affect his life rather than our lives as a couple or family unit. He would talk about how becoming a father would give him purpose, how having a daughter would motivate him to achieve professional success, how this baby would transform him into the man he had always wanted to be. The pregnancy seemed to exist primarily as a catalyst for his personal growth rather than a shared responsibility requiring mutual sacrifice and preparation. Marcus's friends reacted to news of the pregnancy with surprise and some skepticism that he deflected with humor and confidence. Several mentioned his previous statements about not wanting children, his enjoyment of freedom and spontaneity, his past relationships that had ended when partners expressed interest in settling down. Marcus would laugh off these observations, claiming that meeting the right woman had changed his perspective entirely, that real love made him want things he had never wanted before. But I noticed that Marcus rarely included me in conversations about how his feelings about fatherhood had evolved, never acknowledged that his changed perspective might be circumstantial rather than fundamental. He spoke about wanting this baby as if the desire had always existed rather than developed in response to specific circumstances, as if his enthusiasm was inevitable rather than potentially temporary. My own family's reaction to Marcus was cautiously positive, though they expressed some concern about the timeline of our relationship and the practical challenges of planning a life together around an unplanned pregnancy. My mother liked Marcus's charm and apparent commitment, but worried about his lack of steady employment history and tendency to make grand promises without always following through on smaller commitments. My sister Emma was more direct about her reservations, pointing out that Marcus's enthusiasm seemed performative rather than practical, that he talked extensively about the future without taking concrete steps to prepare for it. She had noticed his tendency to disappear during serious conversations about logistics, his discomfort with discussing potential complications or challenges, his focus on the romantic aspects of pregnancy rather than the mundane realities. But Emma's concerns felt overly cautious given Marcus's obvious excitement about the baby and his insistence on being involved in every aspect of pregnancy planning. He attended most prenatal appointments, asked detailed questions about fetal development, and researched everything from birthing techniques to breastfeeding support. His involvement seemed comprehensive and genuine, though sometimes exhausting in its intensity. Marcus's work situation during my pregnancy was inconsistent in ways that created financial stress but seemed temporary and manageable. His sales job involved irregular income based on commissions, which meant some months were financially comfortable while others required careful budgeting and occasional borrowing. Marcus would assure me that his earning potential was unlimited in sales, that becoming a father would motivate him to achieve the kind of success that would provide security for our growing family. But Marcus's approach to financial planning for the baby was haphazard and optimistic in ways that didn't account for the immediate expenses of pregnancy, delivery, and newborn care. He would make grand promises about providing for his family while avoiding specific discussions about budgeting, insurance coverage, or saving for maternity leave. The practical aspects of preparing for a baby seemed less interesting to him than the emotional and romantic dimensions. By my second trimester, Marcus had begun showing signs of anxiety about impending fatherhood that he tried to hide behind continued enthusiasm and reassurance. He would have moments of panic about financial responsibility, concern about losing his freedom, and doubt about his readiness for parenthood that he would quickly suppress or deny when I tried to address them directly. Marcus's drinking increased during this period, though he framed it as stress relief rather than coping mechanism. He would have wine with dinner more frequently, beers while watching television, and occasional nights out with friends that lasted longer than he had initially planned. When I expressed concern about his increased alcohol consumption, Marcus would become defensive, pointing out that he was handling the stress of impending fatherhood better than most men would. The pattern was subtle but concerning. Marcus could maintain enthusiasm about the pregnancy during calm moments but became overwhelmed and avoidant when faced with practical planning or serious discussion about challenges we might face as new parents. He could talk endlessly about the abstract joys of fatherhood but struggled with concrete preparation for the realities of caring for an infant. Marcus's family was supportive but distant, expressing happiness about the pregnancy while remaining largely uninvolved in practical preparation. His parents lived in another state and seemed content to wait until after the birth to become active grandparents. His mother would call occasionally to check on my health and express excitement about meeting her granddaughter, but the conversations rarely included Marcus or discussion of how he was preparing for fatherhood. Most telling was Marcus's reaction to any suggestion that parenthood might be difficult or that we should prepare for potential challenges. He would become uncomfortable with discussions about sleep deprivation, financial strain, relationship stress, or any of the common difficulties associated with new parenthood. Marcus preferred to focus on the positive aspects of having a baby, as if acknowledging potential problems might make them more likely to occur. As my due date approached, Marcus's enthusiasm remained high but had become increasingly detached from practical reality. He could spend hours talking about his dreams for our daughter's future while avoiding discussions about immediate needs like pediatrician selection, childcare arrangements, or maternity leave planning. The pregnancy had become a beautiful abstract concept rather than an approaching responsibility that would require daily sacrifice and commitment. I was beginning to understand that Marcus loved the idea of being a father more than he was prepared for the reality of fatherhood, that his excitement about our baby was genuine but might not translate into willingness to handle the mundane, exhausting, and financially demanding aspects of raising a child. But sitting in our shared apartment, watching Marcus play guitar for my growing belly while promising our daughter that he would always be there for her, I chose to believe that love would be enough to bridge the gap between fantasy and reality. I couldn't have known that Marcus's promises were heartfelt in the moment, but would evaporate the instant they required actual sacrifice. That the man who called our baby his miracle was already planning his escape from the miracle he had helped create. 6 months into my pregnancy, the romantic bubble Marcus had constructed around our impending parenthood began deflating in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. His initial enthusiasm hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had evolved into something more selective and conditional, appearing most strongly when the topic of fatherhood made him look good to others, while diminishing when actual preparation or sacrifice was required. The shift became obvious during prenatal appointments that Marcus attended sporadically despite his early promises to be present for every milestone. He would express genuine excitement about hearing the baby's heartbeat or seeing ultrasound images, but his attention would drift during discussions about delivery preparation, postpartum care, or potential complications that required serious planning and emotional preparation. Marcus's discomfort with medical environments became particularly apparent during appointments that involved detailed discussions about labor and delivery. He would fidget, check his phone, or find excuses to step out of the room when my obstetrician explained pain management options, delivery positions, or the possibility of emergency interventions that might be necessary during birth. His anxiety about medical procedures seemed to override his desire to support me through the pregnancy. When I pointed out his obvious discomfort and suggested we discuss his concerns about the delivery process, Marcus would become defensive about his commitment while deflecting conversations about specific fears or anxieties. He insisted that his nervousness was normal for expectant fathers, that he would be fine when the moment actually arrived, that discussing potential complications was unnecessarily negative and stressful for both of us. But Marcus's avoidance extended beyond medical appointments to practical preparation that required immediate attention and financial commitment. The baby registry we had started together remained largely theoretical, with Marcus expressing opinions about products and brands while rarely making actual purchases. He would research cribs and car seats extensively, becoming an expert on safety ratings and features, but would defer buying decisions until sales events or better timing that never seemed to arrive. The nursery remained unfinished 6 months into pregnancy despite Marcus's early enthusiasm for creating the perfect space for our daughter. He had painted one wall in the soft yellow we had chosen together, then found various reasons to postpone completing the project. Work deadlines, social commitments, and general fatigue became explanations for why nursery preparation kept getting delayed despite its obvious importance and time sensitivity. Marcus's work situation during this period became increasingly unstable in ways that created financial pressure but seemed disconnected from his impending responsibilities as a father. His sales numbers had declined for several consecutive months, resulting in reduced commissions that made budgeting difficult and savings nearly impossible. Rather than addressing the performance issues or seeking additional employment, Marcus became defensive about work discussions and optimistic about commission improvements that would solve our financial concerns eventually. The irregular income created stress about medical expenses, delivery costs, and basic baby supplies that Marcus seemed unable or unwilling to address directly. He would make vague assurances about bonuses and commission improvements while avoiding specific planning about how we would manage the immediate expenses of childbirth and newborn care. The financial responsibility was gradually shifting entirely to me despite my reduced earning capacity during pregnancy and upcoming maternity leave. Marcus's social life expanded during my second trimester in ways that created distance between us despite living together. He began spending more evenings out with friends, claiming he needed social interaction and stress relief to maintain his mental health during this transitional period. These social activities always seemed to occur when I most needed help with pregnancy-related tasks or emotional support for anxiety about approaching motherhood. His increased socializing often involved drinking that went beyond casual social consumption, though Marcus was skilled at minimizing his alcohol intake when confronted about it directly. He would return home late with explanations about unexpected invitations or social situations that had extended longer than planned, presenting his absence as circumstantial rather than chosen. When I expressed concern about feeling lonely and unsupported during evenings when Marcus was out socializing, his response was to suggest that I was being overly dependent and that maintaining individual friendships was healthy for both of us. He reframed my need for companionship during pregnancy as clinginess rather than reasonable expectation of support from the father of my child. Marcus's family relationships during this period revealed concerning patterns in his approach to responsibility and commitment. His parents would call to check on my health and express excitement about becoming grandparents, but their conversations with Marcus often focused on his concerns about losing freedom and independence rather than celebrating his transition to fatherhood. During family visits, Marcus would present himself as enthusiastically committed to parenthood while privately expressing doubts and anxieties that contradicted his public persona. His mother would later share these conversations with me, apparently unaware that Marcus's private concerns about fatherhood weren't being discussed directly in our relationship. Most troubling was learning that Marcus had been researching job opportunities in other cities without discussing these possibilities with me, despite our shared living situation and approaching due date. His explanation was that he wanted to explore all options for providing financial security for our growing family, but his secretive approach suggested motivations that weren't entirely focused on our collective well-being. Marcus's emotional availability declined steadily as my pregnancy progressed, and the reality of impending parenthood became more concrete and immediate. He could still generate enthusiasm for abstract discussions about our daughter's future, but he became increasingly uncomfortable with conversations about immediate challenges like sleep schedules, feeding routines, or childcare logistics that would reshape our daily lives within months. His discomfort was most obvious when friends or family members shared realistic accounts of new parenthood experiences, including sleep deprivation, relationship stress, financial pressure, and lifestyle changes that accompany caring for infants. Marcus would deflect these conversations with humor or change subjects to more pleasant topics, as if acknowledging potential difficulties might make them more likely to occur. The contrast between Marcus's public enthusiasm about fatherhood and his private anxiety about parental responsibilities became increasingly stark as my due date approached. He could perform excitement and commitment convincingly during social situations, but would become withdrawn and avoidant during private moments when planning and preparation were most needed. My friends' reactions to Marcus during this period ranged from supportive to concerned, with several expressing worry about his readiness for fatherhood and commitment to our relationship. They had noticed his tendency to disappear during serious conversations, his discomfort with practical planning, and his focus on the romantic aspects of pregnancy rather than the mundane realities of child-rearing. But their concerns felt premature and unfair given Marcus's continued presence in our shared apartment and his expressed commitment to being an involved father. He was still living with me, still talking about our future together, still making plans for our daughter's arrival. His anxiety seemed like normal pre-fatherhood nerves rather than fundamental unwillingness to accept parental responsibility. My own anxiety about Marcus's behavior was complicated by pregnancy hormones, financial stress, and isolation from support systems that might have provided perspective about whether his actions were concerning or normal. I was simultaneously more emotionally sensitive and more dependent on his support, making it difficult to evaluate his behavior objectively or consider alternatives to our current arrangement. The most alarming development was Marcus's reaction to discussions about legal and practical arrangements for our daughter's care, including birth certificate preparation, insurance coverage, and emergency contact information. He would become visibly uncomfortable with paperwork that formalized his parental responsibilities, claiming that legal documentation was premature until after the birth when we could handle everything more efficiently. Marcus's reluctance to complete practical preparation extended to financial planning for delivery and newborn expenses that were rapidly approaching regardless of his comfort level with formal commitment. He would acknowledge the importance of preparation while finding reasons to postpone specific actions that would ensure we were ready for our daughter's arrival. By 7 months pregnant, I was managing most pregnancy-related logistics independently, while Marcus provided emotional support that was enthusiastic but increasingly superficial. He could still generate excitement about meeting our daughter and building our family together, but his involvement in actual preparation had become minimal and reluctant. The pattern was becoming clear but still deniable. Marcus loved the idea of being a father, but was struggling with the reality of what fatherhood would require from him practically, financially, and emotionally. His commitment was genuine in abstract terms, but fragile when tested by concrete demands for sacrifice, planning, or lifestyle changes. Marcus's promises about being different from other men, about being the kind of father who would prioritize family over everything else, were beginning to sound like reassurances he was giving himself rather than commitments he was making to me and our daughter. The gap between his romantic vision of fatherhood and his actual preparation for parental responsibility was widening in ways that left me increasingly anxious about what would happen when our baby actually arrived. But I was 7 months pregnant, living with the father of my child, and emotionally invested in believing that his love for our daughter would bridge the gap between fantasy and reality once she was born. Marcus still held my belly every night, still talked to our baby about how much he loved her, still promised that everything would work out perfectly once we became a family. I chose to interpret his anxiety as normal pre-fatherhood nerves rather than fundamental unsuitability for parental responsibility. I convinced myself that his avoidance of practical preparation was procrastination rather than reluctance, that his increased socializing was stress relief rather than escape planning. I didn't want to believe that the man who called our daughter his miracle was already looking for ways to avoid the daily reality of caring for the miracle he had helped create. But the signs were accumulating in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore or rationalize away. 8 months pregnant, I was carrying our daughter low and heavy, my body preparing for labor while Marcus seemed to be preparing for something else entirely. His emotional withdrawal had become so complete that we were living together like polite roommates rather than partners about to welcome their first child. The man who had cried with joy at our first ultrasound now avoided touching my belly, as if contact with his growing daughter might make her impending arrival more real than he was prepared to handle. The final month of pregnancy should have been a time of anticipation and preparation, but Marcus's anxiety had transformed into something resembling dread that he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind forced cheerfulness and deflecting humor. When people asked about his excitement for the baby's arrival, he would respond with enthusiasm that sounded rehearsed rather than genuine, as if he were performing the role of expectant father rather than inhabiting it naturally. Marcus's sleep patterns had become erratic, with frequent late nights that he attributed to work stress, but that coincided suspiciously with my own increasing discomfort and need for emotional support. He would stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, claiming he was too anxious to sleep, then wake up exhausted and irritable in ways that made him emotionally unavailable during the hours when I most needed companionship and reassurance. His drinking had increased to the point where he was having wine or beer most evenings, though he would become defensive when I expressed concern about his alcohol consumption during my final weeks of pregnancy. Marcus would point out that he wasn't the one who was pregnant, that he was entitled to stress relief during this difficult period, that moderate drinking was normal for men facing the pressures of impending fatherhood. But Marcus's definition of moderate seemed to expand based on his anxiety levels, and his anxiety levels seemed to increase daily as my due date approached. What had started as occasional social drinking had evolved into daily alcohol consumption that he used to manage emotions he couldn't or wouldn't discuss directly with me. The most alarming change was Marcus's reaction to conversations about labor and delivery, topics that would send him into visible panic despite months of childbirth education classes and medical consultations. He would become pale and shaky when I mentioned contractions, delivery plans, or hospital procedures, as if the mechanics of childbirth were too overwhelming for him to process rationally. When I went into labor on a Tuesday evening in March, 3 days before my due date, Marcus's response was immediate panic followed by frantic activity that seemed designed more to manage his own anxiety than to support me through the birth process. He moved around our apartment gathering hospital bags and timing contractions with mechanical precision, but he avoided eye contact and physical comfort that might have required him to acknowledge what was actually happening. The drive to the hospital was surreal and lonely despite Marcus's presence in the driver's seat. He focused intensely on navigation and traffic while I breathed through contractions that were becoming stronger and more frequent. His silence felt deliberate rather than supportive, as if speaking might make the situation more real than he was prepared to handle. Marcus's behavior in the delivery room revealed the complete extent of his emotional unavailability during what should have been the most significant moment of our relationship. He positioned himself as far from the bed as possible while still technically being present, checking his phone frequently and avoiding looking at me or the medical staff during examinations and procedures. When my labor intensified and I needed his hand to squeeze during contractions, Marcus's discomfort was palpable. He would offer his hand reluctantly, then withdraw it as soon as possible, as if prolonged physical contact during my pain was too emotionally demanding for him to sustain. His presence felt obligatory rather than chosen, dutiful rather than loving. The delivery itself lasted 14 hours, during which Marcus's anxiety seemed to increase rather than transform into excitement about meeting our daughter. He would pace the room during early labor, then sit rigidly in the corner chair during active labor, then stand uncertainly near the door during pushing as if he were looking for opportunities to escape rather than participate in his daughter's birth. When our daughter finally arrived, healthy and beautiful and crying with the strong lungs that announced her presence to the world, Marcus's reaction was relief rather than joy. He seemed grateful that the ordeal was over rather than amazed by the miracle of birth or overwhelmed by love for his child. His first words were about how tired he was rather than how perfect she was. The first few days in the hospital revealed Marcus's complete inability to bond with our daughter or provide emotional support during my physical recovery from childbirth. He would hold her awkwardly when nurses insisted, but he seemed uncomfortable with her fragility and overwhelmed by her needs. Diaper changes, feeding times, and crying episodes sent him into visible anxiety that he managed by finding reasons to leave the room. Marcus's interactions with hospital staff were revealing in their focus on logistics rather than emotional content. He could handle insurance paperwork and visitor coordination, but he struggled with discussions about breastfeeding support, newborn care, or postpartum recovery that required him to acknowledge the ongoing nature of parental responsibility. When visitors came to meet our daughter, Marcus would present himself as a proud father while positioning himself physically distant from me and the baby. He could perform enthusiasm about fatherhood for social situations, but his private behavior contradicted every public statement about his excitement and commitment. The most painful moment came when my mother visited and asked Marcus how he felt about becoming a father. His response was a generic statement about being blessed and excited that sounded hollow and rehearsed. When she pressed for more specific emotions about holding his daughter for the first time, Marcus deflected with humor and changed the subject to hospital logistics. Returning home with a 3-day-old baby should have been a moment of joy and adjustment, but Marcus's behavior made it feel like bringing a stranger's child into an environment where she wasn't entirely welcome. He had not prepared our apartment for her arrival in any meaningful way, leaving me to manage newborn care while also organizing the basic supplies and arrangements that should have been completed weeks earlier. Marcus's approach to nighttime feedings and crying episodes was to remain as uninvolved as possible while still technically being present in our shared living space. He would acknowledge the baby's needs without offering to help, as if her care was exclusively my responsibility despite his physical presence and theoretical availability. His sleep became a protected commodity that took precedence over my rest or our daughter's needs. Marcus would use earplugs or sleep in the living room to avoid being disturbed by nighttime crying, explaining that he needed rest to function at work while I was on maternity leave and theoretically available for round-the-clock childcare. The division of labor that emerged during our first weeks home was completely one-sided, with me handling all feeding, diaper changes, crying comfort, and sleep management, while Marcus maintained his normal schedule with minimal accommodation for our dramatically changed circumstances. He would offer occasional help when directly asked, but his default assumption was that baby care was my domain. Marcus's work life became his escape from the reality of new parenthood, with longer hours and increased travel that he presented as financial necessity, but that seemed designed to minimize his time at home with a crying infant and exhausted partner. He would express sympathy for my fatigue while explaining why his presence wasn't practical or necessary for most childcare tasks. His emotional distance from our daughter was particularly painful to witness because it contradicted everything he had promised during pregnancy about being an involved, loving father who would prioritize family above all other considerations. The man who had talked to my belly every night for months now seemed uncomfortable with sustained interaction with the baby he had claimed to love before she was even born. Marcus's family visited when our daughter was 2 weeks old, and their interactions revealed concerning patterns in his approach to responsibility and commitment that extended beyond our relationship. His parents were excited to meet their granddaughter, but their conversations with Marcus focused on his adjustment difficulties rather than celebration of his new role as father. During their visit, Marcus would disappear for long periods, claiming work obligations or errands that seemed designed to avoid extended time with the baby and visiting grandparents. His absence during family gatherings that should have been meaningful bonding opportunities suggested that his discomfort with fatherhood was becoming unmanageable rather than temporary. The most devastating realization came during our daughter's second week of life, when I understood that Marcus's detachment wasn't postpartum adjustment or new father anxiety, but fundamental rejection of the parental role he had enthusiastically embraced in theory but couldn't handle in practice. Marcus would look at our daughter with something resembling regret rather than love, as if her existence represented a mistake he had made rather than a blessing he had received. The disconnect between his pregnancy promises and his postpartum behavior was so complete that I began wondering if I had imagined his earlier enthusiasm or misinterpreted performative behavior as genuine emotion. By 3 weeks postpartum, I was functioning as a single parent while living with the biological father of my child. Marcus provided financial support and physical presence without emotional availability or practical assistance, as if his obligations ended with conception rather than beginning with birth. The exhaustion of caring for a newborn while managing household responsibilities and recovering from childbirth was overwhelming under normal circumstances, but Marcus's emotional absence made it feel impossible. I was drowning in new mother responsibilities while the person who had promised to share them acted like a disinterested roommate rather than committed partner. Our daughter deserved better than a father who saw her as burden rather than blessing, who provided financial support but withheld emotional connection, who was present in body but absent in every way that mattered for healthy child development. But I was 3 weeks postpartum, exhausted and still hoping that Marcus's behavior was temporary adjustment rather than permanent rejection of the family he had helped create. I couldn't imagine that the man who had called our pregnancy a miracle was already planning to abandon the miracle he had brought into being. 3 weeks postpartum, I woke up to silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping baby, but the unnatural stillness that comes when someone has deliberately removed themselves from your life without warning. Marcus's side of the bed was cold, his clothes were gone from the closet, and a hastily written note on the kitchen counter explained that he needed space to figure things out and would contact me when he was ready to discuss our situation. The note was 3 sentences long, 3 sentences to end what I had believed was a committed relationship built around raising our daughter together. 3 sentences to explain the disappearance of the man who had spent 9 months promising to be the father our child would always be able to count on. The casual brevity of his goodbye was more devastating than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Marcus had packed systematically, taking his essential belongings while leaving behind items that suggested he might return eventually: books, furniture, some clothes, and all the baby-related purchases he had reluctantly made during my pregnancy. The selective packing created false hope that his absence was temporary while ensuring that I couldn't accuse him of complete abandonment. But Marcus's phone went straight to voicemail when I called, his social media accounts were deactivated, and his work colleagues claimed they didn't know his whereabouts when I called his office in a panic. The man who had lived with me for months, who had witnessed his daughter's birth, who had held her in his arms just days earlier, had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The timing of his departure revealed the calculated nature of his escape. Marcus had waited until I was physically vulnerable from childbirth, emotionally exhausted from new motherhood, and legally unprepared for single parenthood. He had chosen the moment when I was least equipped to pursue him or prevent his disappearance, ensuring that his exit would be as difficult as possible for me to challenge. My first instinct was panic about practical matters: rent, utilities, groceries, and all the expenses of maintaining a household that had been shared financially, but were now entirely my responsibility while on unpaid maternity leave. Marcus had contributed irregularly to our living expenses, but his absence meant that I was suddenly responsible for costs I couldn't afford on my reduced income. More immediately terrifying was the realization that I was now solely responsible for a 3-week-old infant who needed round-the-clock care while I was still recovering from delivery complications that made simple tasks exhausting and painful. The physical demands of new motherhood were overwhelming with partner support. They felt impossible without it. But beyond the practical challenges was the emotional devastation of understanding that Marcus had been planning his escape while I was pregnant, that his recent withdrawal hadn't been adjustment anxiety, but preparation for abandonment. The job opportunity he had mentioned researching was apparently real and had been pursued without any consideration of how leaving would affect me or our daughter. Marcus's note mentioned needing time to figure out what he wanted from life, as if fatherhood were an optional lifestyle choice rather than an irreversible responsibility that had begun the moment our daughter was conceived. His language suggested that parenting was something he might decide to do rather than something he was already doing simply by virtue of being her biological father. The cruelest aspect of his departure was how it recontextualized every moment of our relationship, revealing that his enthusiasm about pregnancy and promises about forever had been sincere in the moment but conditional on those feelings remaining convenient and comfortable. When fatherhood proved difficult and demanding, Marcus's commitment evaporated like it had never existed at all. I spent the first week after his disappearance alternating between rage and desperate attempts to contact him, convinced that he would realize his mistake and return to take responsibility for the family he had helped create. I called his friends, his coworkers, and his family members, explaining the situation and asking for help locating him or convincing him to come home. The responses I received revealed that Marcus had been discussing his doubts about fatherhood with multiple people while presenting himself to me as fully committed and excited about our future together. His friends weren't surprised by his departure because he had been expressing anxiety about being trapped by parenthood for weeks before our daughter's birth. Marcus's family was sympathetic but unhelpful, acknowledging that his behavior was wrong while expressing understanding about his feeling overwhelmed by sudden fatherhood. His mother explained that Marcus had always struggled with commitment and responsibility, that she had worried about his readiness for parenthood, but had hoped that becoming a father would help him mature. But their understanding of Marcus's limitations didn't translate into assistance with locating him or convincing him to return. His family seemed to view his abandonment as unfortunate but inevitable, the natural result of someone unprepared for parenthood being forced into parental responsibility by circumstances beyond his control. The legal implications of Marcus's disappearance were complex and frustrating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Establishing paternity, pursuing child support, and ensuring his financial responsibility for our daughter required legal processes that were expensive, time-consuming, and dependent on locating someone who had deliberately made himself unavailable. Marcus had apparently consulted with lawyers before his departure because his disappearance was structured in ways that made immediate legal action difficult. He had left the state, making jurisdiction complicated. He had quit his job before leaving, eliminating the most obvious source of income for child support calculations. He had moved without providing forwarding information, making service of legal documents nearly impossible. The family law attorney I consulted explained that men who wanted to avoid parental responsibility could make themselves very difficult to locate and pursue legally, especially if they were willing to abandon their careers and social connections to escape obligation. Marcus had apparently been thorough in planning his disappearance in ways that would frustrate legal remedies. Meanwhile, I was caring for a newborn while managing the emotional trauma of abandonment and the practical reality of sudden single motherhood. The sleep deprivation, physical recovery, and financial stress were compounded by the constant anxiety about Marcus's location and intentions, creating a perfect storm of circumstances that threatened my ability to function as a mother. My family's reaction to Marcus's disappearance was immediate anger and practical support that probably saved my sanity during those first weeks. My mother came to stay for 2 weeks, helping with baby care and household management while I processed what had happened and began planning for single parenthood. My sister Emma's response was swift and decisive, hiring a private investigator to locate Marcus and consulting with attorneys about legal options for pursuing child support and parental responsibility. Her anger on my behalf was both validating and overwhelming, forcing me to confront the reality that Marcus's behavior was objectively cruel rather than understandably difficult. But Emma's outrage couldn't solve the fundamental problem. I was now a single mother of a newborn, abandoned by someone who had promised to be my partner in raising the child he had called his miracle. The practical and emotional challenges of this situation were mine to navigate regardless of how wrong his behavior had been or how much support my family provided. The most devastating aspect of Marcus's disappearance was realizing that our entire relationship had been based on his ability to maintain enthusiasm for the idea of family without accepting responsibility for the reality of family. He could love the concept of being a father without loving the daily sacrifice that fatherhood required. Marcus had apparently convinced himself that his feelings about parenthood were more important than his obligations to the child he had helped create. His need for personal freedom and emotional comfort took precedence over our daughter's need for a father and my need for a partner in raising her. The note he left mentioned hopping. I would understand his position, as if abandoning a 3-week-old baby were a reasonable lifestyle choice that required empathy rather than a devastating betrayal that destroyed the foundation of trust necessary for any future relationship. But understanding Marcus's position was impossible because his position was fundamentally selfish and irresponsible. He had made promises during pregnancy that he had never intended to keep if keeping them proved difficult. He had participated in creating a life that he was now rejecting because caring for that life required sacrifice he wasn't willing to make. 3 weeks postpartum, holding my daughter while reading his goodbye note, I finally understood that Marcus had never actually wanted to be a father. He had wanted the social status and romantic fantasy of fatherhood without the daily reality of caring for a child. When the fantasy met reality, he chose to preserve the fantasy by abandoning the reality. The man who had called our pregnancy a miracle had decided that the miracle was too much work to maintain. The person who had promised to love our daughter forever had determined that forever lasted exactly 3 weeks after her birth. I was learning that some people can genuinely love the idea of something while being completely unable to love the thing itself. Marcus had loved the idea of being a devoted father without being capable of the devotion that fatherhood actually required. But our daughter deserved better than a father who saw her as burden rather than blessing, who provided genetic material but not emotional support, who was present for conception but absent for every moment that mattered afterward. She deserved better, and somehow I was going to have to be enough to give her what she deserved, even if her father had decided she wasn't worth the effort of staying to find out who she would become. Months of trying to locate Marcus for child support and custody discussions became a full-time job that I was performing while caring for an infant and recovering from the emotional trauma of abandonment. The private investigator Emma had hired found traces of his presence in Colorado, then Arizona, then Nevada, as if he were deliberately moving frequently to avoid being served with legal papers or tracked down for accountability. Each lead that went cold felt like another betrayal, another confirmation that Marcus had planned his disappearance with the kind of thoroughness that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous panic about new fatherhood. He had apparently researched how to make himself legally invisible, how to avoid child support obligations, how to escape parental responsibility with minimal consequences for his future opportunities. The financial devastation of single motherhood was immediate and overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated during pregnancy when Marcus's promises of support had made our situation seem manageable. My maternity leave was unpaid, our shared expenses had become entirely my responsibility, and the costs of legal representation were consuming savings I had been protecting for emergencies that hadn't included being abandoned by my child's father. Childcare arrangements for returning to work became another crisis that Marcus's absence had created without consideration. Infant daycare was expensive and had waiting lists that required advanced planning I hadn't done because I had expected to share parenting responsibilities with someone who was now deliberately unreachable. The gap between maternity leave ending and childcare beginning threatened my ability to maintain the employment that was now our sole source of income. My employer was sympathetic but inflexible about extending unpaid leave beyond the legal minimum, explaining that my position couldn't remain vacant indefinitely while I resolved personal issues that were affecting my availability. The understanding that I was a newly single mother generated sympathy, but not practical accommodation for the realities of managing infant care without partner support. The legal process of establishing paternity and pursuing child support was more complex than anticipated because Marcus had apparently consulted attorneys before his disappearance, structuring his absence in ways that would complicate legal remedies. His resignation from employment before leaving the state eliminated the most obvious source of income for support calculations. His failure to provide forwarding addresses made service of legal documents nearly impossible. My family law attorney explained that deadbeat fathers who wanted to avoid responsibility could make themselves very difficult to locate and pursue, especially if they were willing to abandon established careers and social connections. Marcus had apparently been thorough in planning his escape in ways that would frustrate legal enforcement while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional avoidance. The emotional toll of the legal battle was compounded by having to repeatedly explain Marcus's abandonment to attorneys, investigators, and court personnel who treated paternal disappearance as routine rather than devastating betrayal. Their professional detachment from what felt like the most important crisis of my life was alienating and demoralizing, making me feel like a case number rather than a mother fighting for her child's rights. Marcus's family maintained contact with me during this period, expressing regret about his behavior while providing no useful information about his location or plans. His mother would call occasionally to ask about the baby, sharing her disappointment in Marcus's choices while remaining unwilling to facilitate contact or encourage him to accept responsibility. These conversations were particularly painful because they confirmed that Marcus's family knew he was avoiding his obligations while lacking either the influence or motivation to convince him to do the right thing. His mother's expressions of love for her granddaughter were sincere but ineffective, offering emotional support without practical assistance in holding Marcus accountable. The private investigator eventually located Marcus in Las Vegas, working under a slightly different name at a restaurant that paid cash wages and didn't require extensive background verification. The discovery felt like victory until we learned that Marcus had been tracking the investigation and had moved again by the time legal papers could be served at his workplace. His sophistication in avoiding legal responsibility suggested either extensive research or professional consultation about how to escape child support obligations. Marcus had apparently learned that frequent movement between states, cash employment, and strategic use of false identification could make legal enforcement extremely difficult and expensive for abandoned mothers. The financial cost of tracking Marcus exceeded my ability to sustain the investigation indefinitely, creating a perverse situation where his avoidance tactics were succeeding because pursuing him was more expensive than I could afford on a single income while caring for an infant. The legal system seemed designed for people with unlimited resources rather than abandoned mothers managing survival on restricted budgets. Meanwhile, our daughter was growing and developing without any acknowledgement from her biological father that she existed. The milestones that should have been shared celebrations, first smiles, rolling over, sitting up independently were experienced alone or with my family, who provided love and support but couldn't replace the absent father who had promised to be there for every important moment. The social isolation of unexpected single motherhood was profound and unexpected, as friends and colleagues struggled to maintain relationships with someone whose availability was now completely unpredictable and whose primary topic of conversation had become infant care and legal battles. My social circle contracted to include only people who could accommodate the realities of my dramatically changed circumstances. Dating became impossible not just practically but emotionally, as the betrayal of Marcus's abandonment made trusting new partners feel dangerous and premature. The prospect of explaining my situation to potential romantic interests felt overwhelming, and the risk of introducing additional instability into our daughter's life seemed irresponsible given her father's complete absence. Professional consequences accumulated as well, with my work performance suffering from sleep deprivation, stress, and the constant distraction of legal proceedings that required phone calls, document preparation, and court appearances during business hours. My supervisor was understanding but noted concerns about my availability and focus that threatened the job security we desperately needed. The breaking point came when the private investigator located Marcus in Texas, apparently settled enough to have rented an apartment and established employment at a sales company similar to his previous job. The discovery felt like an opportunity to finally serve legal papers and begin formal child support proceedings that might provide financial stability for our daughter. But Marcus's response to being located was to immediately quit his job and disappear again, demonstrating that his commitment to avoiding responsibility exceeded his interest in maintaining any stability or career advancement. He was willing to sacrifice professional development and financial security to avoid contributing to his daughter's support. The attorney explained that this pattern could continue indefinitely, with Marcus staying ahead of legal proceedings by maintaining a transient lifestyle that made enforcement nearly impossible. Some deadbeat parents spent years evading responsibility, accumulating substantial debt in back child support while never actually paying current obligations. The realization that Marcus might never be held accountable for his abandonment was devastating, but also clarifying about what our future would look like. I could spend years and thousands of dollars pursuing someone who was committed to avoiding responsibility, or I could accept that our daughter and I were on our own and focus on building a stable life without him. The decision to stop actively pursuing Marcus was both practical and emotional, acknowledging that his absence was permanent rather than temporary, and that my energy was better spent on providing for our daughter than trying to force accountability from someone who had already demonstrated complete disregard for his obligations. But ending the legal pursuit didn't end the financial consequences of his abandonment. The mounting costs of childcare, housing, and basic necessities on a single income created constant stress about our long-term security and my ability to provide adequately for our daughter's needs as she grew and her expenses increased. The psychological impact on our daughter was impossible to assess at her young age, but the absence of her father during crucial early development would inevitably affect her understanding of relationships, commitment, and her own worth. How do you explain to a child that her father chose to disappear rather than love her? How do you protect her from feeling responsible for his abandonment? Marcus's family gradually reduced contact as it became clear that he had no intention of returning or accepting responsibility for his daughter. His mother's initial expressions of love and concern for her granddaughter gave way to uncomfortable acknowledgement that maintaining connection with us meant confronting her son's failures as a father and human being. The holidays during our daughter's first year were particularly difficult, representing milestones that should have been celebrated as a family but were instead reminders of Marcus's absence. Christmas morning, her first birthday, Easter, each occasion highlighted the gap between what our family should have been and what it actually was. But our daughter was thriving despite her father's absence, developing into a happy, healthy child who brought joy and purpose to my life, even during the most difficult periods of adjustment to single motherhood. Her laughter and curiosity reminded me daily that Marcus's abandonment was his loss as much as ours, that he was missing the privilege of knowing the remarkable person he had helped create. The legal victory finally came 18 months after Marcus's disappearance, when consistent tracking efforts and interstate cooperation resulted in wage garnishment at his current employment. The child support payments were smaller than they should have been based on his earning capacity, but they provided some financial relief and official acknowledgement of his responsibility for our daughter. But the money felt hollow compared to what our daughter really needed: a father who wanted to know her, who was curious about her development, who saw her as blessing rather than burden. Marcus could be forced to provide financial support, but he couldn't be compelled to provide love, attention, or presence in her life. The realization that legal victory was actually quite limited in its ability to address the real damage of his abandonment was sobering, but also liberating. I had spent months pursuing accountability that would never restore what he had taken from us, the family unit he had promised, the partnership in parenting he had committed to, the father our daughter deserved to have. 2 years after Marcus disappeared from our lives, I was scrolling through Instagram when his face appeared on my feed through a mutual friend's story. He was at a beach somewhere tropical, arms around a woman I didn't recognize, both of them laughing with the carefree joy of people whose biggest concern was choosing which cocktail to order next. The caption read, "Living my best life with my beautiful girl," no mention of the other beautiful girl he had abandoned without a second thought. The photo hit me like a physical blow, not because I missed Marcus or wanted him back, but because it confirmed how completely he had erased us from his existence. While I was struggling with toddler tantrums, daycare costs, and the exhaustion of single parenting, he was posting vacation photos that suggested his life had improved dramatically since abandoning his responsibilities to his daughter. Marcus looked healthy, happy, and prosperous in ways that contradicted his claims about needing to disappear for financial reasons or personal crisis management. The expensive resort setting, designer clothes, and general appearance of success suggested that avoiding child support payments had freed up significant resources for his personal enjoyment rather than indicating genuine financial hardship. His social media presence, which I discovered through careful investigation that felt both necessary and masochistic, painted a picture of someone who had successfully rebranded himself as young, unattached, and free from the complications that children bring to adult life. His posts about adventure travel, professional achievements, and romantic relationships never included any reference to fatherhood or family responsibility. The woman in his photos appeared frequently enough to suggest a serious relationship, someone who either didn't know about his daughter or had chosen to accept his abandonment as reasonable behavior from a man who wasn't ready for parenthood. Marcus had apparently found someone willing to participate in the fantasy that his past could be erased through geographical distance and selective disclosure. But the most devastating aspect of Marcus's curated online presence was how it revealed that his disappearance hadn't been temporary crisis management, but permanent lifestyle choice. He had built a new life that specifically excluded his daughter, not because circumstances made contact impossible, but because he preferred the freedom that came with pretending she didn't exist. The legal victory that had resulted in wage garnishment for child support was being systematically undermined by Marcus's continued job hopping and interstate movement. He would work at positions just long enough for garnishment to begin, then resign and move to different states where establishing new enforcement orders required additional legal processes that were expensive and time-consuming. My attorney explained that this pattern was common among men determined to avoid child support, that the legal system wasn't equipped to handle parents who were willing to sacrifice career stability and professional advancement to avoid financial responsibility for their children. Marcus had apparently calculated that the costs of frequent relocation were lower than the costs of consistent child support payments. The irregular and insufficient support payments created ongoing financial stress that affected every aspect of our daily life. I had to maintain employment that provided health insurance and stability while managing childcare arrangements that consumed most of my income, leaving little room for savings or emergency expenses that are inevitable when raising a child alone. More painfully, I had to watch our daughter begin asking questions about her father that had no satisfying answers. At 2 years old, she was becoming aware that other children had daddies who were present in their lives, who attended birthday parties and school events, who existed as more than abstract concepts mentioned occasionally in conversation. Her innocent questions about where her daddy was and when he would come to visit were heartbreaking in their assumption that fathers were supposed to be present and involved rather than distant figures who sent occasional checks but never called or visited. How do you explain abandonment to someone too young to understand selfishness or betrayal? My family's anger about Marcus's behavior had evolved into protective acceptance that he was permanently absent rather than temporarily unavailable. They had stopped asking about legal proceedings or expressing hope that he would eventually accept responsibility, instead focusing their energy on providing our daughter with the love and stability that her father had chosen not to offer. My mother had become a surrogate father figure in many ways, attending school events and doctor appointments, providing masculine perspective on parenting decisions, and ensuring that our daughter had male role models through her grandfather and uncles who demonstrated healthy masculinity and commitment to family. But family support, however loving and comprehensive, couldn't replace the specific relationship between father and child that Marcus had abandoned. Our daughter would grow up knowing that her biological father had chosen to leave rather than stay, that his love for her hadn't been strong enough to overcome his desire for personal freedom. The social dynamics of single motherhood by abandonment were complex and often isolating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Divorced mothers shared custody and co-parenting challenges that didn't apply to our situation. Single mothers by choice had made deliberate decisions about family structure that felt different from having those decisions made for them by someone else's abandonment. Dating remained complicated by the reality that any serious relationship would need to accommodate a child whose father was completely absent rather than partially involved. Potential partners had to be prepared for the possibility that Marcus might reappear unpredictably, or that his continued absence might create psychological challenges for our daughter that would affect family dynamics. The few men I dated during this period had varied reactions to learning about Marcus's abandonment, with some expressing admiration for my independence, while others seemed concerned about the complicated emotions and legal issues that might accompany serious involvement with someone whose child's father had disappeared completely. Professional consequences continued to accumulate as well, with my career advancement limited by the scheduling conflicts and emotional stress that came with managing single parenthood without any backup support. Missing work for sick children, school events, or daycare emergencies was entirely my responsibility, creating patterns of unavailability that affected promotion opportunities. The financial pressure was constant and exhausting, requiring careful budgeting that left no room for spontaneous purchases or activities that might have enhanced our daughter's childhood experiences. Every expense had to be weighed against immediate needs, creating stress about whether I was providing adequately for her development and happiness. Marcus's continued absence during major milestones felt like repeated abandonment rather than accepted reality. Her second birthday, first steps, beginning to talk, potty training, starting preschool, each achievement that should have been celebrated by both parents instead highlighted his choice to miss the remarkable experience of watching his daughter grow and develop. The most painful realization was that Marcus was missing these milestones voluntarily rather than due to circumstances beyond his control. He could have been present for every important moment, could have known his daughter's personality and interests, could have experienced the joy of being loved unconditionally by someone who shared his genes and features. Instead, he had chosen the immediate gratification of freedom from responsibility over the long-term satisfaction of meaningful relationship with his child. Marcus had traded the opportunity to be someone's hero for the convenience of having no one dependent on his presence or commitment. His social media posts during this period included inspirational quotes about following your dreams, living authentically, and not letting other people's expectations limit your potential. The irony of someone who had abandoned his child posting about authenticity and potential was staggering, though apparently invisible to Marcus himself. The disconnect between his public persona as someone pursuing personal growth and adventure and his private reality as someone who had abandoned his responsibilities to his daughter was complete and seemingly unconscious. Marcus had convinced himself that his absence was self-actualization rather than selfishness, personal growth rather than personal failure. The legal system finally caught up with Marcus in a meaningful way when interstate enforcement cooperation resulted in tax intercepts and asset freezing that made his avoidance tactics more expensive than compliance. The back child support he owed had accumulated to significant amounts that carried legal consequences he couldn't escape through simple relocation. But even consistent child support payments couldn't address the fundamental damage of his absence from our daughter's life. The money helped with practical expenses, but it couldn't provide the emotional security, male role modeling, or sense of being valued that comes from having a father who chooses to be present and involved. The realization that legal victory was hollow compared to what our daughter actually needed was both disappointing and liberating. I stopped measuring success by Marcus's compliance with court orders and started focusing on building a life for our daughter that was complete and fulfilling despite his absence rather than damaged by it. But the photos of Marcus's tropical vacation, his obvious prosperity, and his apparent happiness while completely ignoring his daughter's existence were confirmation that some people can compartmentalize their lives so thoroughly that abandoning their children creates no visible psychological consequences. The man who had called our daughter his miracle had apparently decided that miracles were less important than margaritas on the beach. The person who had promised to love her forever had determined that forever lasted exactly 3 weeks, and that 2 years later she was so irrelevant to his life that he could post about living his best life without any acknowledgement that his best life was built on abandoning his child. Marcus had succeeded in erasing us from his personal narrative, but he couldn't erase himself from our daughter's need for a father who would choose to love her despite the inconvenience. The absence he had created would follow her into adulthood, affecting her understanding of love, commitment, and her own worth in ways that his monthly child support payments could never address. The father who never was had taught his daughter that some people's love has expiration dates, that promises can be broken without consequences, that even blood relationships aren't strong enough to guarantee commitment. But she was learning other lessons too, that mothers can be strong enough to fill gaps that fathers leave, that family can be complete even when people are missing, that love doesn't always come from the people you expect, but it always comes from somewhere. I still have the ultrasound photo where Marcus first saw our daughter's face, his tears falling onto the black and white image as he whispered about how perfect she was, how she was going to change everything, how he couldn't wait to hold his little miracle. The photo is tucked away in a memory box now, evidence of promises that evaporated the moment they required actual sacrifice rather than romantic sentiment. 5 years have passed since Marcus walked out of our lives, leaving behind a 3-week-old baby and a woman who had believed his declarations about forever. 5 years of explaining to our daughter why some children have daddies who come to school plays and others have daddies who live far away and never visit. 5 years of learning that some people can create life without accepting any responsibility for nurturing it. Our daughter is in kindergarten now, a bright, curious child whose questions about her father have evolved from simple inquiry to sophisticated understanding that her situation is different from most of her classmates. She knows she has a daddy somewhere who sends money but doesn't call, who helped make her but doesn't want to know her, who exists as a concept rather than a presence in her daily life. The conversations about Marcus have become more complex as she's grown old enough to understand abandonment, choice, and the difference between fathers who are absent due to circumstances versus those who are absent by preference. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her father chose not to love her without making her feel responsible for his choice? Marcus's social media presence has continued to document a life of apparent success and happiness that makes no reference to fatherhood or family responsibility. His posts about career achievements, romantic relationships, and leisure activities paint a picture of someone whose life improved dramatically after eliminating the complications that children bring to adult existence. The woman he was photographed with 2 years ago appears to be a permanent fixture now, someone who either doesn't know about his daughter or has accepted his abandonment as reasonable behavior from a man who wasn't ready for parenthood. They travel frequently, attend social events, and generally present the image of a successful couple unburdened by dependence or obligations. But what strikes me most about Marcus's curated online presence is how thoroughly he has convinced himself that his current life represents authentic living rather than elaborate avoidance of responsibility. His posts include inspirational quotes about following your dreams and living without regret, apparently unconscious of the irony that his dream life required abandoning his child. The financial aspects of Marcus's absence have stabilized through legal enforcement that finally caught up with his avoidance tactics. Regular child support payments provide basic security, though they represent a fraction of what raising a child actually costs and nothing compared to what a present father would contribute through time, attention, and emotional investment. The money feels hollow because it represents legal compulsion rather than voluntary commitment, payment extracted through wage garnishment rather than offered through love. Marcus contributes financially because he has to, not because he wants to, and the difference between those motivations affects how the support feels both practically and emotionally. More significantly, the child support payments have never been accompanied by any attempt at contact or relationship building with our daughter. Marcus sends money but not birthday cards, provides financial support but not emotional connection, fulfills legal obligations while ignoring moral ones completely. My own life has been rebuilt around the reality of permanent single parenthood rather than temporary abandonment. I've learned to make decisions independently, manage crises alone, and find satisfaction in achievements that aren't shared with a partner who helped create the child we're raising together. The exhaustion of single parenting never completely disappears, but it becomes manageable through routine, support systems, and the deep satisfaction that comes from watching your child thrive despite difficult circumstances. Our daughter's happiness and development feel like victories earned through persistence and love rather than gifts received through favorable circumstances. Dating has remained complicated by the reality that serious relationships must accommodate a child whose father is completely absent rather than cooperatively involved. The men I've considered introducing to our daughter have had to understand that they would be filling a void rather than supplementing existing paternal involvement. The relationship I eventually developed into marriage involved someone who understood that loving me meant loving our daughter completely, that stepfatherhood to an abandoned child required different emotional commitment than blended family situations where biological fathers remain present and involved. My husband has never tried to replace Marcus or pretend that our daughter's biological father doesn't exist. Instead, he has provided the daily presence, emotional support, and consistent love that demonstrate what fatherhood actually looks like when undertaken by someone committed to the role rather than trapped by circumstances. Our daughter calls him Dad because that's what he is in every way that matters, the person who reads bedtime stories, attends school events, provides comfort during illness, and shows up consistently for the mundane and extraordinary moments that define childhood. Biology created her, but commitment is raising her. The contrast between Marcus's absence and my husband's presence has provided our daughter with clear examples of what love looks like when it's genuine versus conditional, what commitment means when it's chosen rather than circumstantial, what family means when it's built on mutual care rather than genetic accident. But Marcus's abandonment still affects our daughter in ways that become apparent during Father's Day activities at school, when classmates ask about her real dad, when she encounters situations that highlight the difference between chosen family and biological family. His absence creates questions that will follow her into adulthood regardless of how well we address them now. The most painful aspect of Marcus's continued absence is understanding that he's missing the privilege of knowing an extraordinary person who shares his features, his intelligence, and probably aspects of his personality that might have created meaningful connection if he had chosen to discover them. Our daughter is funny, creative, empathetic, and wise in ways that would bring joy to anyone willing to spend time getting to know her. Marcus is missing bedtime conversations that reveal her unique perspective on the world, witnessing achievements that would make any father proud, experiencing the unconditional love that children offer to parents who earn it through presence and commitment. His loss is immeasurable in ways he'll probably never understand because understanding would require acknowledging what he abandoned rather than focusing on what he gained through abandonment. Marcus chose immediate freedom over long-term relationship, temporary convenience over permanent connection, selfish comfort over meaningful responsibility. The legal battle to establish his paternal responsibility was eventually won, but the victory felt hollow because it couldn't compel the emotional investment that our daughter actually needed. Laws can require financial support and establish biological facts, but they can't create love, commitment, or the desire to be present in a child's life. Marcus's family maintains minimal contact through birthday cards and occasional phone calls that feel obligatory rather than genuine. His mother expresses love for her granddaughter while remaining unable or unwilling to facilitate any relationship with the son who abandoned his child completely. These connections to Marcus's family serve as reminders that our daughter has biological relatives who know about her existence but have chosen to prioritize their relationship with Marcus over any relationship with her. The message, intended or not, is that his comfort matters more than her need for extended family connection. The most important lesson from Marcus's abandonment has been understanding the difference between people who love the idea of family and people who love the reality of family. Marcus loved the romantic concept of fatherhood, the pride, the legacy, the biological continuation, without being willing to accept the daily sacrifice that actual parenting requires. He wanted the social status of being a father without the sleep deprivation, financial cost, and emotional labor that come with raising a child. Marcus was attracted to the fantasy of family life without being committed to the mundane reality of family responsibility. The pregnancy had represented potential and possibility to Marcus rather than commitment and obligation. When the potential became reality and the possibility became responsibility, his enthusiasm evaporated because it had never been based on genuine readiness for parenthood, but on romantic idealization of what fatherhood might feel like. Our daughter deserved better than a father who saw her as burden rather than blessing, who provided genetic material but not emotional support, who was present for conception but absent for every moment that mattered afterward. She deserved someone who would choose to love her rather than someone who felt trapped by her existence. But she has received better through the man who chose to be her father despite having no biological obligation, through family members who love her unconditionally, through a mother who refused to let Marcus's abandonment define the limits of what our family could become. The world Marcus promised, where he would be the devoted father who prioritized family above everything else, never existed except in his temporary imagination. The promises he made were sincere in the moment but conditional on those feelings remaining convenient and comfortable. When fatherhood proved difficult and demanding, when it required sacrifice rather than just providing satisfaction, Marcus's commitment evaporated like it had never existed at all. The man who called our daughter his miracle decided that miracles were too much work to maintain. But our daughter is still a miracle, just one that Marcus chose not to witness. His absence from her life is his loss more than ours, a choice that will follow him into whatever future he builds with people who don't know what he's capable of abandoning when love becomes inconvenient. The world that never existed was one where Marcus kept his promises, where love lasted beyond the first sign of difficulty, where a father chose his child over his comfort. That world was always fantasy, but the world we built without him is real, complete, and filled with the kind of love that shows up when showing up is hardest. Some people's love expires the moment it requires sacrifice. Others discover that love grows stronger through sacrifice, that commitment deepens through difficulty, that family means choosing each other again and again, regardless of how challenging that choice becomes. Marcus taught our daughter that some promises are temporary, but life taught her that some people keep their promises forever. His absence created space for someone better to fill, someone who understood that being a father means more than contributing DNA to someone's existence. The miracle he abandoned became someone else's privilege to nurture, and that perhaps is the real miracle, not that love always lasts, but that when it doesn't, something better can take its place.